The glass walls of the 34th floor conference room shimmered against the Dallas morning. The city stretched wide below, planes tracing faint white lines across the horizon, an irony not lost on the man standing quietly by the window. Captain Marcus Reed adjusted his tie, the faint reflection of his pilot wings catching the light. Today he wasn't in uniform. He was in a tailored Navy suit, waiting to speak before people who preferred their pilots in cockpits, not boardrooms. Inside, the room buzzed with the low hum of wealth and hierarchy. Every chair had been arranged to signal power, mahogany polished to perfection, chrome nameplates gleaming under the overhead fixtures. Conversations floated in clipped tones, stock projections, merger valuations, and the sort of confidence that only comes from knowing you've never been told no. The meeting had been called to discuss a strategic partnership between Aero Summit Holdings and Hawthorne Aerospace, two companies whose names were stamped on aircraft across the world. But among the board members, one detail stood out like turbulence mid-flight. The presenter scheduled for the morning wasn't an executive, nor an engineer. He was a pilot, and a black one at that. As Marcus stepped forward to set up his slides, a few heads turned, slow, assessing. One man in a charcoal suit whispered something under his breath that drew a smirk from his neighbor. Another adjusted his cufflinks and stared through Marcus instead of at him. The silence between the polite greetings felt heavier than the words that filled it. When Marcus began, his tone was even and deliberate. "Our pilots aren't just employees," he said. "They're ambassadors of trust, and the future depends on who we let into these seats." He outlined a proposal for a new training program, one designed to open doors for underrepresented groups in aviation. His words carried the kind of quiet conviction that came from years of proving worth through performance, not privilege. But conviction alone couldn't cut through bias wrapped in tailored suits. A few board members leaned back, crossing their arms. One scribbled something on his notepad, then tore the sheet clean off. It was the sort of silent dismissal Marcus had seen 100 times in flight briefings, when respect came easily to rank but not to skin tone. Outside, the hum of a departing jet reverberated faintly through the glass. Inside, ambition met arrogance at a table meant for innovation. Marcus continued, pointer steady, each slide showing how inclusivity would improve safety, efficiency, and retention. Still, he could feel the skepticism pressing against him, the kind that no data could disarm. At the far end of the table, the board secretary cleared her throat. "We'll be joined shortly by Mr. Hayes," she announced, glancing toward the door. The murmurs died instantly. Richard Hayes, the company's white CEO, was known for charm that cut sharper than any reprimand. His reputation for humiliating subordinates in front of peers was an open secret no one dared challenge. The door opened. Shoes clicked across marble. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Richard entered with the air of a man who believed silence was his right. His gaze scanned the room, then landed on Marcus with mild curiosity, the kind reserved for something out of place. "Ah," he said, setting down his coffee. "You must be the pilot everyone's been talking about." His smile didn't reach his eyes. Marcus nodded once. "Captain Reed, sir. Thank you for joining us." Richard chuckled lightly. "Oh, I wouldn't miss this. It's not every day the flight crew briefs the board." Laughter flickered around the table, uneasy, complicit. Marcus's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. "I'm here to discuss the future of our fleet, Mr. Hayes." "Then by all means," Richard said, sinking into his seat, "show us how high you plan to fly." The air changed. Every pair of eyes swung between them, and as Marcus advanced to the next slide, the tension in the room climbed, like an aircraft bracing for turbulence that everyone knew was coming, but no one dared to name. If you're already drawn in by how this meeting begins, take a second to hit like and subscribe, and tell us which country you're watching from in the comments. Because bias wears many uniforms, but the story you're about to hear shows what happens when one man refuses to bow to it. The projector hummed softly as the first slide glowed across the conference room wall. Charts, flight statistics, and recruitment projections filled the screen. Clean, factual, irrefutable. Marcus's voice carried steady confidence, the kind built over decades of logging hours where mistakes meant lives, not paperwork. By expanding our pilot recruitment to include underrepresented groups, he explained, we create a workforce that mirrors the passengers we serve. Inclusivity isn't charity, it's strategy. For a moment, the room seemed to listen. Then came the interruption. Richard Hayes leaned back in his leather chair, one arm stretched over its edge like a king disinterested in his throne. His lips curled into what could almost pass as a smile. "Didn't expect a pilot who looks like he flew in from a rap video," he said, voice dripping with amusement. Laughter, not loud, but sharp, broke across the table. A few chuckles came from the end where the finance head sat. Someone muttered, "Good one," under their breath. The HR director glanced down at her notes, pretending to adjust her pen. No one corrected him. Marcus didn't flinch. His hand hovered over the clicker before pressing to advance the next slide. "As I was saying," he continued, "these programs don't just promote equity, they reduce turnover and strengthen safety compliance." Richard's smirk deepened. Safety compliance? From recruits who can barely afford flight school? He took a slow sip of coffee. "Tell me, Captain Reed, Harvard Night School, was it?" The room stirred with uncomfortable laughter. The kind meant to align with power, not humor. Marcus paused. His face gave nothing away. He let the silence hold for a second longer than comfort allowed, then moved to the next slide without acknowledgement. In boardrooms like these, racism doesn't always shout. Sometimes it smirks, sometimes it claps, sometimes it hides behind a joke and watches who dares not to laugh. Marcus's voice returned, calm but anchored. "Actually, I earned my degree on scholarship, aviation science, summa cum laude." His gaze didn't waver. "And every innovation I've presented today is already implemented by our competitors, resulting in 28% higher retention rates." Richard leaned forward. "You mean their pilots aren't quitting because they get participation trophies?" This time, the laughter was louder. Marcus's slides reflected faintly in his glasses as he clicked forward again. The sound of the remote echoed faintly, steady, defiant. "Retention," he said, "comes from respect, not trophies." For the first time, no one laughed. The faint whir of the projector filled the gap. Marcus pointed to a chart showing fuel cost reductions tied to crew satisfaction surveys. "These numbers speak for themselves." Richard folded his arms. "Numbers speak, sure, but investors like stories. And the story you're selling, inclusion, equality, all that PR fluff, it doesn't move aircraft. We build planes here, Captain, not participation campaigns." Another ripple of uneasy laughter. A young analyst sitting near the end avoided looking at Marcus altogether. The HR director scribbled notes faster now, hands trembling slightly. Marcus closed his laptop quietly and looked up. His expression didn't waver, but something shifted in the air, that stillness before thunder. "I understand, sir," he said evenly. "But innovation only flies when everyone's allowed a seat in the cockpit." The words hung there, suspended between courage and consequence. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then Richard leaned back, tilting his chair slightly, his smirk returning like a reflex. "Cute line," he said, "but we build aircrafts, not equality." The silence that followed was heavier than any storm outside. Richard's fingers tapped against the table, the sound deliberate, dismissive. Marcus gathered his notes quietly, his eyes focused not on the CEO, but on the skyline beyond the glass. Somewhere out there, planes were lifting off into blue freedom, while inside this room, a different kind of turbulence had only just begun. The silence after Richard's last remark stretched too long to ignore. A few executives shifted in their seats, unsure whether to laugh or stay quiet. The power dynamic in the room was clear. Laughter meant safety, silence meant risk. Most chose safety. Richard set his cup down and gestured toward the screen. "Thank you, Captain Reed. We'll handle the rest from here." Marcus hesitated just enough to feel the weight of dismissal, then closed his laptop. "Of course," he said evenly. "I'll await your feedback." He gathered his files and walked toward the door, his steps quiet but deliberate. As the door clicked shut behind him, the murmur inside reignited. Laughter returned, louder now, unguarded. "Affirmative action aviators," Richard scoffed. "They think leadership comes with wings." A few chuckled. Others looked down at their notes, pretending to review documents that no longer mattered. By the window outside, Marcus stood still. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, posture steady, eyes tired but unbroken. Beyond him, planes traced silver arcs across the morning sky. Each one a reminder of the dream that had brought him here, and the walls still built to keep him out. He exhaled slowly, hands tightening around the folder at his side. From where he stood, he could faintly hear voices bleeding through the glass. Every word was a quiet echo of what he'd always known. In some rooms, brilliance had to compete with bias before it could even be heard. Inside, Richard's tone sharpened. "You saw it yourselves," he said, gesturing at the door Marcus had just closed. "These diversity hires walk in thinking they're pioneers. They're pilots, not policymakers." A soft cough came from the far end of the table. It was Leah Armstrong, the company's legal counsel, quiet, methodical, and known for her precision in keeping minutes. She didn't raise her eyes, but her pen clicked twice, the sound subtle. The red light on her digital recorder blinked softly against the folder beside her, something Richard hadn't noticed. "I'll include that in the transcript," she said calmly. Richard waved dismissively. "Fine, let them print it in gold for all I care." Laughter followed again, the kind that hides discomfort behind obedience. Every company has witnesses who don't make noise, but they notice everything. They're the ones who file quiet reports, keep quiet copies, and years later are the reason the truth has proof. One executive, a younger man from investor relations, shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, with all due respect, Captain Reed's proposal does make sense financially. Our competitors are." Richard cut him off with a glare. "Save the lectures for HR. This company was built on excellence, not experiments." The young man sank back in his seat. No one else spoke. Leah's recorder blinked again. Outside, Marcus straightened his tie, still unaware of what was being said and what was being preserved. He turned his gaze toward the runways far below, where aircraft lined up for takeoff. For a moment, he closed his eyes. The calm wasn't surrender, it was control. Dignity isn't silence, it's restraint. And restraint has a way of turning into evidence when arrogance refuses to listen. Back inside, Richard leaned back in his chair, enjoying the sound of his own authority. "We'll keep the cockpit pure," he said with a smirk. "No need to hand out wings as charity." The room froze. A few looked at him, then at each other. Leah's pen stopped moving. Her eyes lifted from the page for the first time that morning, just long enough to see the blinking red light still recording. What Richard didn't know was that the meeting's feed, meant for off-site investors, had been left running. His voice, his laughter, his words were traveling far beyond that glass room, and by the time he'd realize it, the world would already be listening. By late afternoon, Aero Summit's headquarters looked as polished as always. Glass, chrome, silence. But beneath that corporate calm, something was spreading faster than any internal memo ever could. The morning meeting, the laughter, the mockery, all of it was now a digital storm in motion. The file began as a single anonymous email. It landed quietly in the inbox of Lauren Jeffers, an aviation journalist known for exposing discrimination cases across the industry. No subject line, no signature, just an audio attachment and a 3-word message. "You should hear this." When she pressed play, the voices filled her office, Richard Hayes' smooth tone curdling into arrogance, the laughter of his board, the line about keeping the cockpit pure. And then, silence. Lauren didn't need more context. She'd covered stories of pilots denied promotions, flight attendants demoted for their accents, engineers overlooked for the wrong last names. But this wasn't speculation. This was proof. Clear, clean, corporate cruelty on record. Within an hour, snippets of the recording hit social media. Someone clipped Richard's laugh. Someone else captioned it with, "This is what leadership sounds like at 30,000 feet of privilege." Hashtags followed. Fly fair, ground haze, equality in the cockpit. By evening, Aero Summit's public relations inbox was drowning in messages. Journalists called non-stop. Flight crews whispered in group chats. The company's LinkedIn page turned into a battlefield of outrage and denial. The skies were quiet, but the servers weren't. Words that once hid behind mahogany tables now echoed through millions of screens. At 6:42 p.m., Richard's phone buzzed repeatedly. The first notification was from the communications team. "We have a situation." The next from legal. "Urgent, media leak." He frowned, glancing at his reflection in the glass wall of his office. How bad could it be? He found out soon enough. The video, a montage of his own words, was already trending on multiple platforms. Someone had spliced the audio with stock footage of airplanes taking off, captioned with lines from his own speech. "We'll keep the cockpit pure. Affirmative action aviators think leadership comes with wings." Each phrase landed like an indictment. By nightfall, the company's shares dipped 3%. Employees avoided eye contact in the corridors. The HR director, the same woman who had averted her eyes earlier, now typed a resignation email she'd been drafting in her head for weeks. Meanwhile, Marcus sat alone in his small office, the city's nightlights flickering across his desk. His phone vibrated with message after message, anonymous notes from employees across departments. "Thank you for staying calm in there. We saw how they spoke to you. You handled it with grace." Finally, someone stood tall. He didn't reply to any of them. He just stared at the skyline, at the blinking red lights on distant towers, thinking about how exposure often comes without victory. Across the city in a quiet newsroom, Lauren Jeffers refreshed her feed. The story had gone national. Talk shows requested statements. Advocacy groups called for investigations. By midnight, Aero Summit had become the headline no corporation wanted. Aviation giant faces racism scandal after CEO's remarks leak online. At 7:12 a.m. the next morning, Richard stormed into headquarters, his expression rigid, jaw locked. "Who leaked it?" he barked at his assistant. She didn't answer. Her eyes were red, maybe from exhaustion, maybe from disappointment. He slammed his door shut. The blinds rattled. In the hallway, whispers spread faster than the truth itself. The staff knew what he didn't. The board had already scheduled an emergency session, and this time, his name wasn't on the attendance list. Inside the glass conference room, chairs filled one by one. The same walls that once trapped laughter now felt suffocating. Leah Armstrong, the legal counsel, placed her recorder on the table. The red light blinked again, calm and constant. "Let the record show," she said quietly, "that this meeting has been called to address a leadership crisis." Richard's seat at the head of the table remained empty, a symbol of authority that had finally outlived its owner. Outside, Marcus arrived through the side entrance, unaware that his quiet composure had already become legend across the company. The story wasn't about who leaked it anymore. It was about what had finally been exposed. And in the silence that followed, the boardroom prepared to decide the fate of the man who thought no one was listening. The morning light cut through the glass walls of Aero Summit's top floor, illuminating faces drawn tight with unease. Coffee cups sat untouched, folders opened but unread. The same room that once echoed with laughter now held its breath. At exactly 9 o'clock, the door swung open. Richard Hayes stormed in, phone still pressed to his ear, barking into the receiver. "Find out who sent that file. I don't care what it takes." He hung up and scanned the room, his eyes flashing with fury. No one spoke. He threw his phone on the table and leaned forward. "Let's get one thing straight. That recording, whatever it is, was taken out of context, and whoever leaked it will be fired." Richard turned toward the HR director. "Start the meeting. Now." The HR head, Evelyn Ross, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Before we begin, Mr. Hayes, we've received multiple formal complaints." She opened a folder, her hands trembling slightly. "From staff, pilots, and even external partners." Richard waved her off. "Nonsense. A few overreacting employees and a journalist looking for a headline." Evelyn cleared her throat. "The complaints cite hostile behavior, discriminatory remarks, and abuse of authority." Richard scoffed. "Discriminatory? I was joking." Everyone in that room laughed. Across from him, Leah Armstrong, the company's legal counsel, straightened her glasses and placed her recorder on the table, the same one that had captured his words the day before. "The board has reviewed the transcript. This isn't about humor. It's about conduct. You've breached the company's anti-discrimination policy and violated federal labor law." A murmur rippled through the table. Richard's tone hardened. "You're out of line, Leah. I built this company. You think a few lines of edited audio can tear that down?" Leah's gaze didn't falter. "No, Mr. Hayes, but your own words can." A beat of silence. Then Evelyn continued reading, each sentence tightening the air. "Statements from employees detail ongoing intimidation, racially charged remarks, and retaliation fears." Richard laughed bitterly. "Let me guess, all anonymous?" Leah folded her hands. Actually, some weren't. Captain Marcus Reed agreed to attend this session as a witness. The door opened quietly. Marcus stepped in, composed as ever. He didn't gloat, didn't glare. His presence alone shifted the room's gravity. Richard's expression froze. "You have no business here," Leah replied coolly. "He was the subject of your remarks. He has every right." Marcus took his seat at the end of the table. The calmness in his voice cut deeper than any accusation. "I'm not here for revenge," he said. "I'm here for accountability." Richard leaned back with a mocking smile. "Accountability? You think one clip gives you the moral high ground?" Marcus reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. "No," he said, sliding it across the table, "but this might." Leah picked it up, her brow furrowing as she read the first page. "This is a pilot safety audit," she said slowly. "Filed last quarter, but never signed off." Marcus nodded. "I was assigned to review discrepancies in training expenditures. I found millions in mismanaged funds, all authorized under Mr. Hayes' signature." The room went dead silent. Richard's face drained of color. "That's absurd," he stammered. "You don't understand how budgets—" Marcus cut him off gently. "I understand numbers. I also understand accountability. You mocked inclusion while covering mismanagement under the same roof." Richard's hands clenched. The power that once filled his tone now cracked at the edges. Around the table, no one came to his defense. The HR head closed her folder. "We'll need to discuss this in executive session." Leah turned off her recorder. "Mr. Hayes, please step outside. The board will deliberate." He stood slowly, eyes darting across the room for any sign of loyalty. There was none. And as the door closed behind him, every person left at the table knew the same thing. The turbulence he created had finally reached the cockpit. The room stayed still long after Richard stepped out. The hum of the air conditioner was the only sound that dared to move. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Not of sympathy, but of disbelief. What Marcus had revealed wasn't a rumor or a personal grievance. It was documented truth, printed in black and white. Leah opened the folder fully and read the audit summary aloud. Under the category Pilot Training Development, approximately $4.6 million was redirected to personal expenditures, executive retreats, luxury charter bookings, and private hospitality bills signed off by Mr. Hayes. The words hung like smoke. Nobody reached for their pens, nobody spoke. Across the table, Marcus sat quietly, his composure unwavering. He wasn't there to humiliate anyone. He was there to ensure that the same walls that protected arrogance were finally forced to listen. Leah continued reading, her tone calm but precise. The funds were pulled from the budget meant to modernize simulator programs and diversify training outreach. Essentially, money meant to elevate new pilots, including minority recruits, was used to finance vacations under corporate morale development. Evelyn, the HR head, pressed a hand to her forehead. "Dear God," she whispered. "We canceled 3 training cycles last quarter because we claimed there wasn't enough funding." One of the board members leaned forward, voice trembling with restrained anger. "If this gets out, it's not just a scandal. It's a betrayal of every employee who believed in this brand." Marcus spoke softly, each word measured. "It already got out, just not to the people who could fix it. Until now." Leah looked toward him. "How long have you known?" "Long enough to give him a chance to correct it," Marcus replied. "But arrogance doesn't take correction. It mistakes silence for approval." As if summoned by his own arrogance, the door opened sharply. Richard walked back in without being called. His tie was loosened, his composure fading. "You think you can turn this company against me?" he snapped, eyes locked on Marcus. Marcus didn't move. "I didn't," he said quietly. "You did." The words cut deeper than any accusation. Richard froze, rage flickering into disbelief. "You think they'll take your side? You think they'll let a pilot, a diversity hire, lecture me on leadership?" No one laughed this time. Even the executives who once laughed the loudest now sat rigid, unwilling to meet his gaze. Leah closed the folder deliberately. "Mr. Hayes, your comments and financial conduct constitute a breach of ethics and fiduciary trust. The board is obligated to act." Richard scoffed. "You can't act without me." At that, the double doors opened again. The board chair, Daniel Holt, entered. Silver-haired, respected, and known for the kind of leadership that didn't shout to be heard. He took his seat at the head of the table. "On the contrary, Richard," he said evenly, We already have the authority to do so. Richard's voice faltered. Daniel. The chair raised a hand. Enough. He looked around the table, his expression grave. We've reviewed the evidence, we've heard the complaints, and now this audit confirms what we can no longer overlook. The silence thickened. Every head turned toward him as he spoke the next words slowly, deliberately. We'll proceed with a vote of no confidence in the leadership of Richard Hayes. Richard froze, the color draining from his face. For years, Richard believed control was the same as respect. But respect isn't commanded, it's earned. And the higher arrogance flies, the steeper the fall when gravity finally calls its name. The gavel struck once, sharp and final. The tension inside the boardroom had changed form. It was no longer fear of Richard Hayes, it was the quiet realization that his power had finally reached its limit. The blinds were drawn now, the skyline hidden, the only light coming from the chandelier above the glass table where years of dominance were about to collapse into history. Daniel Holt, the board chair, cleared his throat. We'll proceed, he said calmly. Each member will record their vote verbally for the minutes. The motion: removal of Richard Hayes as Chief Executive Officer of Aero Summit Holdings, effective immediately. The silence that followed was suffocating. Richard's chair creaked as he leaned forward, eyes darting across the faces that once smiled at him during golf outings and charity dinners. You don't want to do this, he said quietly. You'll regret it. No one replied. Leah Armstrong read the official motion aloud, her voice steady, professional. Then she looked to the first board member. Mr. Graham? The man hesitated, his hand trembling over the tabletop. I vote yes. Richard turned sharply toward him. After all I've done for your division? Graham avoided his gaze. Especially because of that, he said softly. The next member spoke. Yes. Then another. Yes. One by one, the words stacked like bricks sealing a tomb. The rhythm was steady, deliberate, a verdict delivered by those who had once hidden behind his laughter. When Leah reached Evelyn Ross, the HR director, she didn't hesitate. Yes, for every complaint buried under policy. Richard slammed his palm on the table. You're making a mistake. You think the press will stop with me? You'll all be dragged into this circus. Daniel remained calm. The circus began when you mistook humiliation for leadership. The vote continued. Even Richard's closest ally, his COO, the man who had defended him through every scandal, took a long breath and said, yes. That was the last thread snapping. Leah turned toward the chair. Final count, unanimous, motion carried. The words landed like the sound of landing gear locking after a turbulent flight, heavy, decisive, irreversible. Richard stared around the room, his mouth opening but no words forming. The authority that once silenced others now meant nothing. Security officers appeared quietly at the doorway, summoned without instruction. Their uniforms reflected in the polished table as they stepped forward. Gentlemen, Daniel said firmly, escort Mr. Hayes to retrieve his belongings. Richard's jaw clenched. You'll regret this, he hissed, but his voice cracked under the weight of humiliation. Cameras from the corridor flashed through the open doorway. Reporters had already arrived. The sound of shutters followed him down the hallway, echoing like applause for justice long overdue. Inside the room, no one moved for several seconds. The air finally felt breathable. Some exhaled, others simply stared at the empty seat where power had just been evicted. Marcus sat quietly, hands folded, eyes lowered. He hadn't spoken since the vote began. Leah looked over at him. Captain Reed, she said gently, could you step outside for a moment, please? For the first time, he looked puzzled. Of course. As he stood and walked toward the door, the tension in the room didn't dissipate. It shifted. This wasn't dismissal. This felt different. The handle turned. The door closed behind him. And for a brief, uncertain silence, the future of Aero Summit and the man who had just redefined its conscience hung suspended in the air. The atmosphere in the boardroom had shifted completely. The tension that once revolved around Richard Hayes' authority was gone, replaced by a quiet respect directed toward the man who had sat through humiliation and answered with dignity. Marcus stood near the window, his hands clasped loosely before him. Below, the city moved as usual, unaware that inside this glass tower, a new chapter in corporate justice was unfolding. Daniel Holt, the board chair, broke the silence first. Captain Reed, he said, voice steady, You've shown restraint when most would have retaliated. Integrity like that doesn't go unnoticed." Marcus didn't respond immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the horizon, where morning light scattered over the airport runways in the distance. Leah folded her hands. "The board has unanimously decided to appoint you as interim director of flight operations. You've proven leadership under pressure, and a standard this company desperately needs." The offer hung in the air, monumental yet understated. Around the table, heads nodded in agreement. Evelyn from HR added softly, "You've earned more than an apology. You've earned a seat." Marcus turned toward them, expression calm, thoughtful. "I appreciate your confidence," he said finally. "But this isn't about a title." Daniel frowned slightly. "Then what would you call it?" "A responsibility," Marcus replied. "One I'd rather share than hold." He stepped closer to the table, placing a single page before them, a proposal he drafted long before the scandal. "I want to start a mentorship initiative for underrepresented pilots, not just here, but across our industry. A space where skill, not surname, defines potential." Leah scanned the paper quickly, eyebrows lifting. "The Reed Mentorship Program?" Marcus smiled faintly. "If that name helps, sure. But what matters is what it stands for. Opportunity that isn't conditional." Evelyn leaned forward, her tone softening. "You'd turn down an executive position to mentor others?" "Titles don't create change," Marcus said. "People do. Change doesn't need a corner office, it needs doors that open for everyone." The statement silenced the room again, though this time it wasn't discomfort, it was reflection. For once, the glass walls of Aero Summit didn't feel like barriers, they felt like mirrors. Daniel nodded slowly. "Then it's settled. We'll approve funding for the initiative immediately. And Captain Reed, your input will guide its foundation." Marcus gave a brief nod of thanks. "I'll hold you to that, sir." Outside, the faint sound of ringing phones began to rise. PR teams were already scrambling. News anchors rehearsed their opening lines. Screens across the country flashed with breaking headlines. Aviation CEO removed after racist remarks. Pilot's integrity praised as catalyst for change. Leah's phone buzzed. She glanced down, then exhaled. "The press already knows. Investors are issuing statements, supportive ones." Daniel gave a thin smile. "Then we stay ahead of it. We lead by example." Marcus remained quiet, his reflection faint against the glass. The same reflection that once looked wounded, now composed. When racism tried to corner him, Marcus didn't fight for vengeance. He fought for structure. He turned insult into instruction, hostility into policy. In a world that tried to shut him out, he built a door wide enough for others to walk through. The phones kept ringing, headlines kept spreading, but Marcus simply looked out over the skyline, not at what had been destroyed, but at what could now take flight. And as Daniel's voice broke through the noise, "Captain Reed, I think you've just redefined leadership at this company." The world outside was already beginning to echo his story. News anchors prepared to go live. The headline ticker rolled. From bias to reform, the pilot who grounded prejudice at 30,000 feet. Marcus's phone vibrated with a new notification, this time from an unknown number. He opened it. "We'd like you on CNN tonight. America needs to hear what happened in that room." He exhaled slowly, pocketing the phone. The story had left the boardroom. Now it belonged to the world. The story that began in one glass-walled boardroom had now spilled across the country. News outlets replayed the leaked audio, dissected the board's swift decision, and turned Marcus Reed into an unexpected symbol of grace under fire. Talk shows debated whether corporate America was truly changing or merely polishing its image. Some called it progress, others called it public relations. In cities from Atlanta to Seattle, flight academies posted Marcus's photo on bulletin boards and newsletters. The pilot who stood tall. Young trainees saw in him not a corporate hero, but proof that professionalism could withstand prejudice, that restraint could be revolutionary. A week after the board's announcement, Marcus arrived quietly at North Texas Aviation Academy, where he'd trained years earlier. The smell of jet fuel and asphalt greeted him like an old friend. Students gathered in the hangar, whispering, eyes wide. When he stepped to the front, their applause felt heavier than the sound of engines, raw, human, grateful. He didn't stand behind the podium. He simply walked among them, his voice calm and grounded. "You've probably heard too much about what went wrong," he began. Let me tell you what can still go right. The room stilled. Every word carried weight, not because it was loud, but because it came from someone who had lived what they feared. The cockpit doesn't care what color your hands are, he said, his gaze sweeping across the room. Only how steady they are. The students smiled. Some nodded. One young woman near the front wiped away quiet tears. The academy director approached him afterward. "Captain Reed," she said softly, "you could have left the industry altogether." "After what happened?" Marcus smiled faintly. "You don't leave the sky because of turbulence," he replied. "You just learn to fly smarter." That evening, as dusk fell over Dallas, screens across the country flashed with a familiar face. Richard Hayes, clean-shaven, expression carefully measured, he appeared before a cluster of microphones. "I want to publicly apologize," he said, tone steady but hollow. "My words were insensitive. I've reflected deeply on the harm they caused. Apologies without accountability are like planes without engines, impressive on the runway, but they never take off." Richard continued, eyes flicking to the teleprompter. "I will be stepping down indefinitely to focus on personal growth and awareness." The camera zoomed in on his face. It was the performance of regret, not the practice of it. Within days, he disappeared entirely. No interviews, no follow-up, no return to the industry he once ruled. Meanwhile, Marcus's initiative gained momentum. The Reed Mentorship Program launched in partnership with 2 major flight schools, offering scholarships and simulator access to students who'd once thought aviation was out of reach. For Marcus, redemption wasn't measured in revenge or headlines. It was in every young pilot who walked through those hangar doors, shoulders squared with new confidence. And as he watched a new class of cadets taxi onto the runway, the sound of their engines rose, steady, unified, unstoppable. 1 year later, the skyline above Dallas shimmered in morning light, planes cutting across it like silver promises. Aero Summit Holdings had changed its colors, not on its logo, but in its values. The same building that once silenced progress now displayed a bronze plaque at its entrance. The Reed Initiative, advancing equality in flight. Employees passed by it daily, some pausing to read, some still in quiet disbelief at how far things had come. What began as a scandal had become reform. What started with humiliation had turned into history. Inside the lobby, a new mural stretched across the wall. Young pilots, engineers, and mechanics of every background captured mid-motion, and at the center, etched in sleek lettering, "Integrity is the runway to innovation, Captain Marcus Reed." Marcus stood quietly at the dedication ceremony, dressed in a simple Navy suit, no medals, no spotlight. The applause from employees and trainees wasn't the roaring kind, it was respectful, steady, genuine. When he stepped forward to speak, the room fell silent. 1 year ago, he began, I stood in this building wondering if decency still had a place in leadership. I learned that sometimes change doesn't start with the loudest voice. It starts with the one that refuses to echo hate. His eyes scanned the room. Faces that once looked away now met his gaze with quiet pride. The Reed Initiative isn't about me, he continued. It's about making sure no one is ever told they don't belong in a place they've earned. Applause filled the space again, echoing softly off the glass walls that once trapped arrogance. Across the industry, other companies followed suit, adopting bias training programs, mentorship schemes, and anonymous reporting systems inspired by his initiative. Magazines featured him not as a hero, but as a reformer. He declined awards quietly, redirecting recognition toward his students. Meanwhile, Richard Hayes remained a footnote in trade journals, a cautionary tale of how fast privilege can descend when stripped of empathy. The story didn't end with an applause line. It ended in the quiet spaces, in the Flight Academy hangars where young cadets practiced landings with new confidence, in meeting rooms where diversity wasn't a checkbox but a foundation, in hallways where respect no longer had to ask for permission to enter. At sunset, Marcus walked across the runway. The golden light glinted off the tail of a newly branded training jet, its name painted just beneath the cockpit, the Reed One. He paused, hand resting against the cool metal. The engines hummed softly, ready for takeoff. "Keep flying higher," he whispered. He came to the skies for freedom, found bias in the clouds, and still chose to rise above it. Because real flight isn't about altitude, it's about integrity. If you were Marcus Reed, would you have stayed silent or spoken mid-flight? Have you ever faced bias disguised as company culture? Do you believe redemption is enough, or should there always be accountability? What would equality look like if every workplace gave people like Marcus the same chance to lead? Tell us your thoughts in the comments. Your story might help someone who's still finding their wings. Like and subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ, because silence should never be the end of any story.